Morley Robbins. Such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. This is going to be an amazing conversation for our
Well,
listeners who don't know who you are, which would be very surprising to me now at this stage. But
well,
Morley, you are the creator and founder of the Root Cause Protocol, and you're involved with the Magnesium Advocacy Group. You also
that's right.
received a BA in biology from Denison University in Ohio and hold an MBA from George Washington University in healthcare administration. And you are just, in my opinion, an absolute game changer when it comes to health. And you've been around for quite a while, making a difference and trying to spread the word, especially in the area of iron, which is what we're going to
Hmm.
get into today. And before I let you say hello, you may
Yeah.
notice how I say iron, a little bit different how other people say it.
You got that Irish lilt to your iron.
I
That's
do.
very funny. No, I'm delighted to be here. I really look forward to our conversation. And it's a subject that, for whatever reason, is very near and dear to my heart because I think there's so much confusion around it. And the biological problems that follow trying to resolve an iron problem are many and varied, as you well know. And so hopefully we'll be able to pull that apart and get people to see this whole issue from another light.
Yeah. So let's start with the basics. Like, what is this iron problem that we seem to have? Why do we keep getting told time and time again that we
Right.
have an iron deficiency or anemia?
Right. So let's go back a little bit in time to give people a proper context. There was a time on this planet when there was no oxygen, and iron was the dominant metal. It was an anaerobic environment, and iron was hanging out with sulfur. And for whatever reason, there was bacteria, cyanobacteria, blue bacteria,
Hmm.
cyano, sky blue bacteria, that started to engage in photosynthesis with this bright star in the sky. And it's like, and this happened a long time ago. And we have 21% oxygen in the air that we breathe right now.
Mhm.
Back then, when it was 1/10 of 1% oxygen, it wiped out 99% of life on the planet.
Okay.
That's how disruptive oxygen is to life in the absence of copper. Ding, ding, ding. And so copper is a very important metal that's grossly misunderstood, especially in this modern era, because from my research and from my experience with clients, there are two foundational toxins that are easily overlooked. There's the master pro-oxidant metal called iron. It's the number one element on the planet. 36% of the Earth's composition is iron. And then the second most reactive element on the planet after fluorine gas
Oxygen.
is oxygen. Very, very reactive. And what do they like to do? They like to create rust. And they're really good at it, except when they're hanging out with copper. And copper is the only element on the planet that can regulate iron and oxygen at the same time and not create a problem. That's an important foundation for people to understand. And that when copper really began to flex its muscles a long time ago, there were three chemicals that got formed. There's an enzyme that turns oxygen into water that allowed the release of energy. They're called multi-copper oxidases, and they are ancient primordial enzymes. And what's an enzyme? It's just a little engine, gets stuff done. That's all it does. And that little engine saved us. Then there was a second chemical that got made. It's called melatonin. It's not a sleep aid. It's the master antioxidant inside our mitochondria, which are where the energy is made. And then my favorite chemical that came along, third chemical that emerged in this very early time, is called cholesterol.
Oh.
And it turns out that it takes 11 molecules of oxygen to make one molecule of cholesterol.
Mm.
And so what cholesterol represents is an oxygen sink. So if you can't activate the oxygen to make it water, to release the energy, well, let's protect it. Let's store it. And this goes back to the beginning of time. So cholesterol is not a disease. The buildup of cholesterol is not a disease. It's a sign of copper deficiency. It's absolutely amazing. And so the question that you're posing is, how do we get it so wrong in this modern era? And as I've pieced it together, the misunderstanding began around the time of the First World War, the Great War, right? They always have these momentous shifts in society around the war because they can get away with it. And they started studying, quote unquote, anemia back around the First World War. So what's important to understand is that at any given time, 1% of society is pregnant. The other 99% are not pregnant.
Mhm.
And what did they decide to do? They decided to study the pregnant women to see what happened to iron during the course of their pregnancy. Well, it's a known fact that as the pregnancy progresses, you get to about 20 weeks and the amount of hemoglobin starts to go down.
Mm.
It's how Mother Nature responds to the pregnancy, because what's really important is you've got to begin to move that hemoglobin to the baby. The baby needs that hemoglobin, and they're taking away from mom. Why? Because she's supposed to be making breast milk. Now, what you may or may not know is there's a huge problem today in women not being able to make breast milk.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because they got too much iron in their body.
Yeah.
And they think that their hemoglobin needs to be up around 12 to 13 or 120 to 130, however your yardstick works.
Yeah.
Because that's the thinking or the metrics of the conventional birthing practitioners, when in fact a UK-based obstetrician, Philip Steers, in 1995, he studied 150,000 live births. I would have been impressed if he'd studied 1,500.
Yeah.
So he studied 150,000 live births to see what are the healthiest babies and what's the hemoglobin of the mom attached to those healthiest babies.
Mm.
And what he was, I think, probably somewhat surprised to find out is that the hemoglobin of the mom that produced the healthiest babies was between 8.5 and 9.5, or 85 to 95. And that's heretical in the modern era, this idea. And so what they did back in the 20s, without the benefit of Dr. Steer's research, is that they noted that the women's hemoglobin was going down during the pregnancy. And they said, see, they're anemic. And what they chose to do, this is an amazing public health initiative, because the pregnant women were expressing low hemoglobin in their blood, they decided to inoculate the 99%. And that's when all of these programs started, with iron fortification and the perception that everyone's anemic. And for those who are listening, it's important to know that the meme that runs modern medicine is you're anemic and you're copper toxic. I want you thinking you need so much more iron. I want you terrified to take copper. And in fact, the reality is just the opposite. So this misunderstanding began back at the First World War, and it's just been building. It's like a snowball rolling downhill, getting bigger and more distorted. And now the conventional birthing practitioners are adamant that the woman's hemoglobin needs to be at least 12 or 120, better above that. And they profess that that's going to protect them when they deliver the baby, so it will be a protection against hemorrhaging. Do you know what chemical is essential to prevent hemorrhaging during the delivery? it's absolutely fascinating. Do you have any idea what it is?
Copper
No, no.
and progesterone.
That those are two excellent guesses. It turns out it's oxytocin, the love hormone, the bonding hormone, the lactation hormone. What turns out, oxytocin is the chemical that clamps off the blood vessels upon delivery, and it's the chemical that starts to cinch the mom so she goes back to her pre-pregnancy size. So when you see women who are like they're still pregnant, but they've already delivered the baby, they don't have any oxytocin that's working. And so
That
to
why
your point
women
about
who breastfeed seem to bounce back faster because there's more
absolute,
oxytocin.
exactly, absolutely right. And the key is um, the oxytocin. It's only, I think it's like 9 peptides, 9 amino acids long. It's really, really tiny. Like like ceruloplasmin, which is the protein that is the beast that protects copper and expresses different enzymes. It has 1,046 amino acids.
Well,
And here's this little tiny peptide, nine amino acids long, and it needs to be activated by another enzyme. It's called the PAM enzyme. Nobody's ever heard of it. No doctor you've ever gone to has ever heard of it.
oh, no.
And the enzyme stands for peptidoglycine alpha amidine monooxygenase. And I want you to know I get $1 every time I say it. And
Just
so
say it again. I didn't quite hear it.
but the PAM enzyme activates thousands of peptides, signaling hormones, signaling neurotransmitters in our body, and nobody knows anything about
So
it.
how
And
does I'm
so
just Morley, how does glycine affect that enzyme? Because it does have a glycine in it.
it does. In fact, what it's doing is it's replacing um, what's called a carboxyl group with an amine group. So carboxyl is going to be carbon and oxygen, and the amine group is going to have nitrogen and hydrogen. When you put the nitrogen and hydrogen on that, it the it comes to life. What copper is doing, working through that PAM enzyme, is bringing good things to life. And the part that people don't know about is that the hormones and the neurotransmitters and the signaling peptides in our body are made as parked cars. Is a car of any benefit if it's in a driveway?
No.
No, you got to get it on the highway so you can go someplace. And the PAM enzyme gets those chemicals on the highway. And so the reason why the glycine is so important is it's the glycine end of the peptide. The peptide is, when you say the word peptide, you're talking about proteins that have less than 100 amino acids, many of which have less than 50, some that have less than 10, like oxytocin. And so for some reason, these really tiny chemicals have this explosive impact in our body. And today, what happens in a birthing suite is they'll use, here in the States, they use what's called pertussin. There's different names for it around the world, but they know the women don't have the copper to activate the enzyme, so they give them a synthetic form of it that's already been activated. And it doesn't have the same effect.
That seems silly. Why wouldn't you just advise the woman to either take a very good copper supplement or eat copper rich foods during her pregnancy?
Right.
Like everything
Exactly.
in conventional is a little backwards.
Exactly. And so there's a lot of confusion around um, iron based on pregnancy. That's not how I would have started the study. And and then it gets aggravated that from the time of the Civil War in the US, the 1860s, up until 1972, when Dr. Jacobs, who was a hematologist based in Wales, the British Isles are really important
I know
for
we're
hematology.
geniuses out
No,
there.
you really are. No, no, I'm not kidding. It's amazing what the real breakthroughs are Dr. Orozio and Harrison. And there's some really big names. But they published a study in the British Medical Journal in 1972 that moved the spotlight away from hemoglobin and moved it over to ferritin, which is the iron storage protein. And now what's happening is people are ignoring the hemoglobin, which is where 70% of the iron in the body is hemoglobin, another 10% is myoglobin. And it's basically a waiter carrying oxygen. So 80% of the iron in our body is a waiter. Another 10% is ferritin, the storage protein. But ferritin is supposed to be inside the cell. It's not supposed to be in the blood, which is outside of the cell. It's really important for people to realize that ferritin is being measured. Picture a farm. There's a field, and then there's a barn. Well, when the farmer wants to know how many bales of hay do I have in my barn, do they go out into the field to measure it? No, that makes no sense. They're going to go into the barn and count the number of bales in the barn. But what they're doing with ferritin is they're going out in the field of blood and counting the ferritin in the field, ignoring the fact that there's ferritin is supposed to be in the barn. And it seems like a small point, but it's enormously important because the ferritin that shows up in the blood, in the field, is different than the ferritin that's inside the barn, inside the cell. And the ferritin in the blood has no iron in it. That's not my opinion. That's the opinion of some of the leading hematologists on the planet. And so we're using this protein, this iron storage protein, as a marker for iron inside the cell, but it's not accurate because it doesn't have iron and it's a different length. There's about 10 amino acids missing in the ferritin that's in the blood. And the public doesn't know that. The practitioners don't seem to know that. And so we have a very distorted understanding of what's happening. And so there really are three ways to measure iron status.
Well, Morley, before you get into that, I just want to stop you there. So it's clear our methods of testing iron are very outdated. And even if they were indated, they went about it the complete wrong way with the pregnant women. So now that's based on that study in World War I, that's where we've got our ranges from. And that's what we're looking at on blood panels. But now we're also looking at on blood panels ferritin, which actually doesn't contain iron in the first place. So we're looking at something that's almost irrelevant.
No, I'm with you 100%. And so I had the honor of talking to Douglas Kell, who's a world-renowned iron biologist. He was University of Manchester. Mm-hmm. Very affable guy. He's about my age. He's in his early 70s. And he has this wall of books behind him. And he has more degrees than a thermometer. And he was kind enough to take my call. Because my strategy is if I find an article that's just amazing, I'll call the author up and thank him for the author. This particular article that I was impressed by, if an article has 100 footnotes, that's a lot. If it has a couple hundred footnotes, they're really quite intense.
They know what they're talking about.
Dr. Kell's article it's from 2009, and the title is "Iron Behaving Badly." Again, he's a world-renowned iron biologist. He had 2,400 footnotes. So what he was trying to tell the scientific and clinical community. You're not just wrong about iron, you're dead wrong. And so I called him up. We were having back then it was a Skype call. And I asked him point blank. I said, Dr. Kell, what is the ideal what's the ideal ferritin for a human being? And he said, 0. I said, what? And this is a quote from that conversation. He said, Morley, I want to make sure you understand this. He said, rising ferritin in a blood test is not a sign of iron vitality. It's a sign of organ pathophysiology. He said, do you understand what I just said? I said, absolutely. He said, I've read your articles. I've read other articles. He said, that's where the confusion is thinking that ferritin should be higher. And here's the really, you were asking about thyroid and the relationship to iron. Thyroid medications, think about this. Thyroid medications are designed to work when the individual's ferritin levels are over 100. So basically what they're telling you is, I want you to have iron dysregulation. We don't like, within the root cause protocol, we don't like to see the ferritin above 20. See, Dr. Kell can get away with 0. We can't get away with 0. That's just like to try to defend 0 in the public domain would be amazing. But so our threshold is 20. Medications are being designed for over 100. And we've had practitioners going through our training within the RCP Institute, and they don't even flinch until it's in the thousands. I'm like, no, you don't understand. This is a really, the thing that people don't realize is that the ferritin, when it shows up in the blood, it means it's already dumped its iron into the tissue, usually the liver or the spleen. So it's dumped its iron, and then it gets cleaved, the amino acids get taken off it, and it gets secreted into the bloodstream. It's like, and I think the reason why it gets secreted is to try to get the attention of the individual, get the attention of the doctor. And it's just that people are not picking up the not so subtle cues. And so ferritin is now becoming this marker for, oh, you're low, you need more iron. Not knowing that ferritin has a relationship with another hormone called hepcidin. You may or may not have heard of hepcidin.
I have. Yeah.
Many of, okay, so you've heard of it. Some of your
Most
listeners
people
may not have
haven't.
heard of it. Right. And so think of your mom as a positive regulator in your family. She made sure you got a good night's sleep, got dressed, got fed, did your homework, and went off to school. Now, it's an iconic image. That's what moms are supposed to do, or it's what parents are supposed to do. Could be dad as well. Think of hepcidin as a SWAT team that's correcting bad behavior. Well, there's a difference between the way your mom or dad would correct your behavior and a SWAT team. That's just going to break the door down. They're going to make sure that stuff gets done. And that's the power of hepcidin. It's really powerful, very strong. And if you don't understand that if ferritin is low, it means hepcidin is high, because they ride on a seesaw together. And why is hepcidin high?
Trying to keep everything in order.
Trying to keep everything in order in the absence of copper. Everything comes back to the copper. Everything comes back to iron and oxygen. And hepcidin rises when there's a lot of inflammation. And so there's a whole category of anemia called anemia of chronic inflammation. I happen to think that that's the dominant form of anemia. And what anemia technically means is low hemoglobin in the blood, low red blood cell in the blood. Anemia, emia is Latin for blood. It's without in the blood. And so but it's a very charged word. When you hear that you're anemic, it means that you're barely there, that you're weak. It has a lot of negative connotations. And as soon as people hear the word anemia, they flip out, because they don't want to have low iron. They don't want to be weak in the iron. And I
Well, they
think
feel
it's,
exhausted as well.
they do feel exhausted. And the reason why they feel exhausted is that their iron recycling system is not working right. And this would be a really important part for your listeners to understand. Much of the understanding about iron is based on dietary iron and how well you absorb it, right? We're supposed to get about 18 to 20 milligrams of iron a day in our diet. Hope we absorb it. And there's no awareness about the iron recycling program. So we've been chatting now for about 25 minutes. And every second of every day, we need to replace 2.5 million red blood cells every second. So 25 times 60 times 2.5 million, it's a big number. And in the course of 24 hours, it's 200 billion red blood cells that need to be turned over. Why is this important? Because every red blood cell has 1 billion atoms of iron. It's a lot of iron in just one red blood cell. Then we have bazillions of red blood cells in our body. 1% every day, we have to replace it. And the formal name of that is called the reticuloendothelial system. It took me 2 years to figure out that meant recycling. And everybody knows their liver. Most people don't know about their spleen.
No.
It's called the hidden organ. And it's actually the organ of odd numbers 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, and 11 all relate to the spleen. It's 1 inch thick, 3 inches wide, 5 inches long, weighs 7 ounces. Under stress, it weighs 7 pounds. What's the increase in weight due to? Iron getting stuck in the spleen. And what's the 9 through 11? It's ribs 9 through 11. It's hiding behind ribs 9 through 11. So nobody knows about the spleen. Do you know what color your spleen's supposed to be? Do you have any idea?
Yellow?
No, not yellow. Picture an eggplant. It's supposed to be that royal purple. And when I was describing this a couple of years ago, one of my students was a surgeon here from the US. She said, Morley, I've never seen a purple spleen. That should make everyone nervous because the heart is supposed to be red. The liver is supposed to be brown. The gallbladder is supposed to be green. And the spleen is supposed to be purple because there's energy behind those colors. There's function behind those colors. And so if the spleen is not purple, it's not able to turn over the red blood cells. And so what's happening in the spleen is it's taking this 2.5 million red blood cells a second, breaking it into its parts, but getting the iron attached to transferrin, which is the transport protein, to get iron back to the bone marrow, which is where half of our copper is found. 47% of the copper in the body is hanging out in the bone marrow. Wow, that's a lot of copper because it's very much involved in making new blood and making new bone. It's absolutely amazing what's going on inside the bone marrow. But it turns out that 200 billion red blood cells every 24 hours only requires 24 milligrams of iron, which is a teeny tiny amount. We have 100 milligrams of copper in our body, but the average woman should have about 4,000 milligrams of iron, average guy about 5,000. But if you really want to understand your iron status, you take your age and you multiply it times 365. So Chemaine, how old are you?
36.
36. So 36 times 365, that's 13,140 milligrams. This isn't my formula. This is the formula that's used by all the iron biologists around the world. And so we accumulate at least 1 milligram of iron a day times our age. So instead of having 4,000, you have more than 4 times more iron than you should have, 3 times more iron than you should have in your body.
Hopefully
And
less.
well, hopefully, yeah. But the average person is going to have a multiple. I'm 72. I've got like 26,000 milligrams of iron if you follow that formula.
Yeah, yeah.
And the is iron accumulation is what's behind all aging. When you see your skin changing, your hair color is changing, your energy is changing, your muscles are
Oxidation.
changing, oxidation. And so that's why this iron recycling system is so important. And I think it's unfortunate that people don't know about the recycling because that's where 95% of our iron comes from the recycling system. Only 1 milligram a day is needed from our diet. That's very different than 18 to 20. And
And
there's some
very
supplements
different
that,
from, excuse me, Morley, but also
yeah,
very different from these massive iron supplements that people are taking as well.
ex exactly. There's a prenatal that has 65 milligrams of iron. I recently heard of a UK-based nutritionist whose father became anemic. He'd had a heart attack, became anemic, and the doctor put him on 900 milligrams of iron a day. And
Surely
guess what
that would
happened?
kill him sooner.
And it did. He had a heart attack and died. And so there's a complete misunderstanding about the known relationship between copper and iron working through the copper protein ceruloplasmin. And it's critically involved in this recycling program because the enzyme function of ceruloplasmin is what allows the iron to get out of the spleen, get onto the transferrin, get down to the bone marrow so it can be recycled and put into new red blood cells. And there's no awareness of this at all.
No, there isn't.
No one knows about it.
So, two things, Morley, before we get into the testing part, because I want people to understand that the tests that their doctors are doing, it is not accurate. It's quite misleading.
Right.
So, first, what you've kind of alluded to already is that we're not low in iron, we're not anemic. What we are low in is copper. If we don't have copper, we're not activating the iron, and therefore we're not getting the benefits of either the iron or the copper. And then the second thing would be inflammation plays a huge factor in this. Even just, I'm still hung up on what you said about the spleen because growing to 5 pounds, which is, that's insane.
Well, it absolutely is. And so the thing is, it depends on where you put your focus. So when you do a blood test, you're focusing just on the blood, right?
Mm.
We've got to move back and say, what's the level of iron in the body, which is a blend of tissue, organs, especially, and the blood. And so I really challenge people that there is, in my opinion, unless you've been in a car accident and you actively are bleeding, I don't think there is true anemia on this planet in the abstract. And what I think we've got is this complete mismatch between low iron in the blood and high iron in the tissue. And the iron is stuck. It can't get out. It can't get back into the recycling program because the doorway, it's called ferroportin, iron doorway, ferroportin, iron doorway can't open because it requires a copper doorman, really important. And if you can't recycle the iron, then it will begin to look low in the blood. But that does not mean that you are systemically body-wide deficient. It means there's iron dysregulation. There's a big difference between iron dysregulation and iron deficiency. And that's where I think the real breakdown in understanding takes place.
Yeah, that's where the confusion is. So
Absolutely.
this fatigue people are feeling, and they're going to their doctors and they're saying, I'm just exhausted. And the doctor will then, well, let's test your iron levels. And they primarily are looking at ferritin, iron saturation. Oh, it's low. Here's an iron supplement, Ferromax, whatever it is.
Right, right.
Instead, maybe it is that you need to release the iron that's in your tissues so you can utilize it properly, and copper is a factor there. And also, maybe we need to look at your inflammation and how that's impairing not just the iron recycling cycle, but all the cycles and organs, and how that
Yeah,
is a factor in why you're so exhausted. So it's not that you just need an iron supplement. I suppose this is where holistic health comes in, where we have to look at the whole picture.
totally. And the thing is that I would encourage people who feel they are anemic, and there are a lot of people who have that perception. Google two different terms: iron deficiency anemia, and then Google copper deficiency anemia. And what you're going to find is that the symptoms are identical. But for some unknown reason, the practitioners are only trained in the iron side. And as soon as someone presents with fatigue, which is what my book is all about, cure your fatigue. As soon as they present with fatigue, the practitioner always defaults to the iron side, never thinks about the copper side. And there's a famous iron biologist here in the States. He's no longer with us. This is back. He wrote a very important article in the 1971. And it was about iron and copper and ceruloplasmin, the protein that regulates both of them. And I'd read this article, it was probably a decade ago, so I'd forgotten parts of it. But I came across it recently in the last couple of weeks, and I was stunned to find out, relearn that a week before an animal is deemed anemic, the enzyme expression that ceruloplasmin is best known for is called ferroxidase. So it's oxidizing iron so that it can be put onto transferrin, or it can be stored in ferritin. It's got to be in what's called an oxidized state, which is ferric iron. It's a +3 form. So it turns +2 iron into +3 iron. That enzyme is called ferroxidase. But what they found is when they were working with these animals is that one full week before they were deemed anemic, the enzyme expression of ceruloplasmin was 0. There was no enzyme expression, which means there was no ability to get the iron out of the tissue, get it onto the transferrin, get back into the recycling system. And that's the beauty of copper, is it keeps the recycling system working. And there's no awareness about this when you go to a conventional doctor. Even a functional doctor doesn't know this. They don't know about the recycling program. They don't know about the copper side of the house. They don't know about retinol, which is the partner to vitamin D. And maybe that'll be one of our future conversations. Mm-hmm. But if you don't understand retinol and its role to make copper usable, well, then you don't understand how the body works. And so that's where there's a lot of confusion. And then back to our opening discussion about pregnancy, where are all the optics in conventional obstetrics? Iron and vitamin D. You want to have a healthy baby? You want to have a fetus be fully developed? You got to have magnesium, copper, and retinol. And there's no testing for these. All the focus is over here. And these are polar opposites. And so people don't realize how out of sync modern conventional thinking is to Mother Nature, who knows that for the brain development of the baby, it absolutely has to have magnesium and retinol and copper. And there's no discussion. There's no testing of any kind during pregnancy, during 9 months of pregnancy. There's never any consideration given to magnesium, copper, or retinol. And what's the foundation of breast milk? Retinol, mm-hmm. Vitamin A. And cholesterol. Because at the end of breastfeeding a baby, the retinol stores in the mom are empty. Mm-hmm. So it's just like, come on, we gotta rethink this and get people to wake up to the ways of Mother Nature and the way we were originally designed to function.
Okay, I have a few questions. So,
Sure.
one, if we do see anemia on a blood test and the
Right.
doctor wants to give a ferritin or an iron supplement, we would be better positioned to get them optimizing for copper first to try release the iron and encourage. And that in itself should help with the energy production systems as well. Would we
Absolutely.
see then, because this iron recycling starts to get it dumped back into the system where we can use it, would we then
Right.
see the ferritin start to increase on a blood panel? And
Absolutely.
one more thing as well. With that said, and what you have spoke about, if we're offsetting the damaging effects of iron accumulation, and every time I think of oxidative stress with iron, my brain goes back to my granny used to have this white gate for years and years, and every year it kept getting more rusty and started chipping away.
That's right.
Would that make copper an anti-aging tool, potentially slowing down aging and the wrinkles? I might be asking selfishly for myself here.
No, that famous copper scientist, his name was Loren Pickart, Pickart. He discovered a copper peptide, copper um, GHK copper peptide. And it's being used a lot in a lot of different formulas. But Dr. Pickard named his company Reverse Skin Aging. And so if iron accumulation is the sign of aging, what you'll find in all life forms on the planet, the early life form, the young cells of a plant, the young tissue of a mammal, is heavy concentration of copper.
Mm.
And it is the inverse, it's the opposite of iron. And what's important is for people to realize that this very unassuming but critical factor on our planet is what's regulating the iron, regulating the oxygen. And the way I describe it is copper is the general and iron is the foot soldier. And you don't need to be in the military to know there are fewer generals than there are foot soldiers. And the general has sway. The general, the enzymes that copper is able to activate and regulate is amazing. Here's an example. I just learned this again from this article from Dr. Earl Frieden from 1971. Every biologist that talks about copper always has their favorite enzymes. They'll talk about cytochromes deoxidase. They'll talk about a number of different enzymes that are very, very critical, but they always have two or three that are kind of their favorites. Like, I'm really attached to this one. So in his list is Baker's dozen of copper enzymes. He talked about an enzyme called Rubisco, Rubisco, like Nabisco. Mm-hmm. Rubisco stands for ribulose, it's a sugar, mm-hmm. Ribulose diphosphate carboxylase. Wow, that's a mouthful. Mm-hmm. And could they make it any more threatening to try to understand it? But what Rubisco does, this is really important. Everyone knows what photosynthesis is.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, sun kisses the plant, and a lot of good things happen. We get, all sorts of benefit from that. Rubisco enzyme, which is copper dependent, ding, 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 is what puts the carbon in the glucose to allow it to become a sugar. Mm-hmm. It's the most prevalent enzyme on planet Earth. And we're supposed to believe that copper is toxic. And so our scale of understanding of copper's role on this planet is so far-fetched and so out of sync with reality. And all of our mitochondria, we have 40 quadrillion. Again, big number, goes right over your head. Well, I don't know that number, so it can't be that important. No, it's really important because it's 15 zeros. So we've got this massive energy production in our body. They can't make ATP without complex 4. It's copper dependent. That's where oxygen becomes water to release the energy. And if you can't release energy, you are going to be fatigued. And so why do people who are, quote, anemic presenting with this low iron in the blood? Because you got to have energy to properly recycle 2.5 million times a second. And people don't take into account the energy side. And so what we talk about within the RCP is ignore the enemies, ignore the pathogens, ignore the heavy metals, ignore the toxins. We ignite the energy. The blueprint that runs our immune system requires energy. And if you can make energy, you can sit back and relax. And so that's where our whole focus is so different than the world of convention, even the world of alternative medicine, because they're afraid of copper.
Yeah, they're talking about copper toxicity right now.
Talking about copper toxicity. And it turns out that the level of unbound copper in the cell is non-existent. It's got 21 zeros before the one, which means it's non-existent. Complete misunderstanding about copper in the blood. So that here's the fun relationship between copper and iron. When iron shows, how do you say iron again? I want to make sure I pronounce it right. Iron. When iron shows low in the blood, it's high in the tissue. Copper is just the opposite. When copper shows high, toxic in the blood, what's it telling you?
Low in the tissue.
It means it's low in the tissue. And people don't realize that. And where is copper needed? If iron's high in the tissue and you're short on copper, that's your source of inflammation. That's where the crisis is.
So, Morley, I know you have to go now in a minute. So I think in our next conversation, that's where we'll get into testing, because I know people are going to say, well, what should I look at then on a test? But I want your opinion on two things before we let you go.
That's fine.
For donkey's years, as we say in Ireland, forever, right. I have been drinking 2 teaspoons of liquid chlorophyll every single day. And okay. I am a huge advocate for dark chocolate, like really good quality organic. I personally eat 100% raw dark chocolate. And I've been doing both of these for years and years and years. And both are a viable source of copper. What do you think of that? Like, have I got the right approach there? Am I doing the correct thing?
No, you absolutely are. There's an amazing case study. It actually takes place in Canada. I think it's in like Toronto or Montreal. The lead author's name is Shibazaki, Shibazaki, and it's 2017. And it's looking at an old man who gets admitted into the hospital and he can't stand. He's a complete wreck. He's a heavy drinker. And these 2 doctors, they're very smart. It's such an amazing case study. But the resident, the older doctor, said, I think we better test his copper status. And what they found was that his copper was in single digits, which is a scary level. And his ceruloplasmin was very, very low. Supposed to be at 30. He was down in, I think he was in low double digits. And what's absolutely amazing, this guy could not stand. And then the resident said, well, we're going to give him hot cocoa. And that's all they gave him. Hot cocoa with heavy cream and whipped cream. How many days do you think it was before he could stand on his own?
2.
It was 3 days. That's how powerful really good chocolate can be. It's a really good source. You have to spell it right? There's a difference between cacao and cocoa, right? So you got to start with CAO. And the beauty of chlorophyll what brand do you use? Do you know?
I use Now, if you Now
Okay,
Foods, but I've also
sure.
used I think it's Sovereign Laboratories, Sovereign something or other. I've used theirs as well.
Okay, those are two good sources. Another one for people to consider is Bernard Jensen, Jensen. Bernard Jensen International has a phenomenal chlorophyll. It's from alfalfa grown in pristine fields in Spain. You know, for those who want to go to Spain, but the chlorophyll, classic chlorophyll, is the same molecule as hemoglobin. It's just hemoglobin has iron in the center. Chlorophyll has magnesium in the center.
Yeah.
But what it also has is something called chlorophyllin, has an IN on the end. And the chlorophyllin has copper in the center of that molecule. And that copper is able to help regulate the iron that's needed to make the hemoglobin. And so the chlorophyll, so what the body's doing is essentially replacing the iron into the chlorophyll and it becomes hemoglobin. Absolutely amazing.
We're going to
So those
finish
are
up
both
now.
great sources.
We're going to
What's
finish
that?
up. I said we're going to finish up now, but I have had two men, and we'll totally get into this on our next conversation. I had two men in the last year with extremely high copper loads, like scary high. And
Okay.
I advised both men to go on Sovereign Copper and their hydrosol nanoparticles of
Right.
copper.
Sure.
And they
Yep.
felt wonderful on that. A little bit expensive in Canada, but it was the best option I could find for a copper, and it's in liquid form for them.
Well, let's send me the whatever metrics you have on those two cases, and let's talk about that because I want to understand, was it in a hair test or a blood test that
It
the
was
copper
blood.
was high?
Yeah, it was
It was
blood.
blood. And did you also look at the copper as the ceruloplasmin and
They
vitamin A?
don't test ceruloplasma here. Like, I
They
never
don't.
ever see it. So I did consultations, looked at the full symptom picture, looked at the inflammatory markers. There was some fatty
Perfect.
liver, there was cholesterol issues. There was a lot of inflammation, which is why I kind of poked you on the inflammation issue earlier.
No, that's fine. So again, just to reinforce the point, they showed high iron, excuse me, high copper in the blood. Where do you think the copper is missing in their body?
No, it was high iron in the blood, very high iron in the blood. They had like no copper.
Oh, they had high iron. Oh, I thought you said copper. My
No,
apologies.
high iron.
Okay, so that makes perfect sense to me as it relates to the liver condition. So we can pick that up. Those would be fascinating case studies to
I'll write
explore.
it down now. Yeah.
That's
Okay,
great.
well, Morley, you've got an appointment. Thank you. We're going to catch up and schedule in our next conversation, and that's where we'll get into the testing aspect.
I love it. Look forward to it. Thank you for the opportunity to have the
Thank
conversation.
you for your time, and it's iron.
Iron, and make sure that your followers know that they can ask their questions, get their questions to you. But if for any reason they want to reach out to me, they can do that as well.
Yeah,
So we'll
I
we'll
will. I'm
talk more
going to
about
put
that.
all the contact details below and even your
That's great.
Instagram page. So we'll chat soon, Morley. This has been great.
I look forward to it.
Thank
Okay.
you.